All right, so today we're diving into this idea of multipolarity. It's something we hear a lot about these days, especially when it comes to global power dynamics.
It's definitely a hot topic, and for good reason. I mean, it really gets to the heart of how the world is changing, who's calling the shots and how that impacts, well, pretty much everything.
Exactly. And for our listeners out there, especially those prepping for the UPSC International Relations exams, understanding multipolarity is, well, it's not just an academic exercise.
Oh, absolutely not. It's about understanding the forces that are shaping the world we live in, the challenges and opportunities that countries like India are facing, and how to navigate this increasingly complex global landscape.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly are we talking about when we say multipolarity?
At its core, multipolarity refers to a world order where power is distributed among multiple centers of influence. It's a shift away from a system where one superpower, like we saw with the United States for much of the past century, dominates the global stage.
Okay, so instead of one big boss, we're talking about a world with multiple power players. So who are these new kids on the block? Who are the rising stars challenging the old guard?
Well, the most obvious example is China, right? Their economic growth over the past few decades has been nothing short of phenomenal, and they're increasingly translating that economic might into geopolitical influence.
Yeah, China's definitely a force to be reckoned with. But it's not just them, right? What about other players like India, Russia, or even regional powers like Brazil and South Africa?
You're absolutely right. It's not a simple two-way competition between the US and China. Other countries are stepping up too.
Yeah.
India, for example, is experiencing its own economic boom and is asserting itself more and more on the global stage.
That's interesting. So we've got this mix of established powers like the US and Russia and rising powers like China and India. But what does this actually look like in practice? How does this multipolarity play out in the real world?
Well, think about it like this. For decades, the global institutions, the rules of the game, so to speak, were largely shaped by the West, particularly the US and its allies.
Right. The victors of World War II basically set the stage for the world we live in today. But in a multipolar world, those institutions are going to have to adapt, right?
Exactly. And that's where things get interesting. A truly multipolar world would mean a redistribution of power, not just economically and militarily, but also within these global institutions. We're talking about things like the UN Security Council, the World Bank, the IMF.
So these institutions, which have been sort of the guardians of the global order for so long, are now facing a challenge to their authority. And for a country like India, which is aspiring to play a bigger role on the world stage, this shift towards multipolarity presents both opportunities and challenges, right?
Absolutely. On the one hand, a multipolar world could give India more space to maneuver, to pursue its own strategic interests without being overly reliant on any one power.
So it's a chance for India to chart its own course, to become a more independent player.
Exactly. But on the other hand, it also means navigating a much more complex and potentially volatile geopolitical landscape. There are more players, more interests at stake, and the potential for miscalculation or conflict is higher.
So it's not just about opportunities.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the risks as well. All right, let's dive a bit deeper into the players driving this shift. You mentioned China's economic growth, but it's not just about their economy getting bigger, right? There's something more to their rise as a global power.
Right. It's not just about GDP. China has been very deliberate in using its economic clout to build influence around the world.
Mhm.
Think about the Belt and Road Initiative, for example.
Ah, yes, the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
This massive infrastructure project that's connecting China to dozens of countries across Asia, Africa, and even Europe. It's pretty ambitious.
To say the least. And it's a perfect example of how China is using its economic power to shape the global landscape, to build networks of influence, and to secure its access to resources.
It's like they're creating their own version of globalization, with China at the center.
In a way, yes. And this is something that policymakers in India and elsewhere are watching very closely because the Belt and Road Initiative has clear strategic implications. It's not just about building roads and bridges. It's about power projection.
It's about influence. And for India, with the Belt and Road Initiative literally passing through some of its neighboring countries, this is a significant development. It's like China's expanding its footprint right on India's doorstep.
Exactly. And it highlights the need for India to develop its own strategic partnerships, to counterbalance China's growing influence, and to carve out its own space in this multipolar world.
Welcome back. So we were talking about China's growing influence.
Yeah, that Belt and Road Initiative really got me thinking. It's a powerful example of how this multipolar world is taking shape, how these new power dynamics are playing out in real time.
Absolutely. And it's not just about China's rise. It's about a broader realignment of power with different actors trying to, well, kind of fill the vacuum, as the U.S. maybe takes a step back from its traditional role as the global policeman. Right. So it's like everyone's looking for an opening, a chance to make their move. But for a country like India, which is trying to find its place in this new world order, it must be a bit like walking a tightrope.
That's a great analogy. India has to maintain good relations with all the major players while also protecting its own interests, which might not always align.
Yeah, it's a delicate balancing act. But to really understand how India can navigate this multipolar world, maybe we should step back for a moment and look at it through the lens of international relations theory. Realism, liberalism, those kinds of frameworks.
That's a great idea because these theories can help us make sense of the motivations, the driving forces behind the actions of states.
Right, so it's not just about describing what's happening, it's about understanding why. So let's start with realism. How does that perspective shed light on this multipolar world?
Realism would tell us that states are primarily driven by self-interest, by a desire to maximize their power and security in a world that's inherently competitive, kind of a dog-eat-dog world.
So from a realist perspective, all this talk about cooperation and global governance, it's kind of a smokescreen.
Well, not necessarily a smokescreen, but realists would definitely argue that states will always prioritize their own interests, even if that means bending or breaking the rules.
Okay, so there's a healthy dose of skepticism there. What about liberalism then? How does that school of thought view this multipolar world?
Liberalism tends to be more optimistic. It emphasizes the role of international institutions, cooperation, and the idea that states can work together to achieve common goals.
So for liberals, multipolarity doesn't have to be a recipe for chaos. It could actually lead to a more stable and cooperative world order.
Exactly. If states can find ways to build trust, to create effective institutions, and to work together to address shared challenges like climate change or global pandemics.
Okay, so we've got realism on one side, emphasizing self-interest and power, and liberalism on the other, focusing on a cooperation and institutions. Are there any other theoretical frameworks that can help us understand this multipolar world?
Oh, absolutely. Constructivism, for example, reminds us that international relations aren't just about material power. Ideas, norms, and identities also matter.
So it's not just about who has the biggest guns or the most money. It's about how states perceive themselves and each other. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about the world.
Exactly. And those stories can change. The norms and values that shape international relations aren't set in stone. They're constantly evolving. And that's especially true in a multipolar world where new actors are challenging the old order.
Okay, so we've got these different lenses through which we can view multipolarity. Realism, liberalism, constructivism. But let's bring it back to India for a moment. How do these theoretical frameworks help us understand India's position in this new world order?
Well, realism would suggest that India needs to be pragmatic, to focus on building its own power and influence, and to be wary of getting too close to any one power, even its allies.
That's about playing the game strategically, about hedging your bets and not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. Liberalism, on the other hand, would encourage India to engage with international institutions, to build partnerships with like-minded countries, and to play a constructive role in shaping the global agenda.
So it's about working within the system, trying to make it more inclusive and responsive to India's interests.
Precisely. And constructivism would remind us that India's role in the world is also about its identity, its values, and its vision for a more just and equitable global order.
It's about projecting soft power, about showcasing India's democratic values and its commitment to pluralism and tolerance. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about the rise of these new power centers, what it all means for global institutions, even dipped our toes into some international relations theory.
Yeah, we've been through realism, liberalism, constructivism, even touched on this idea of nonpolarity. But now, I guess the big question is, where do we go from here? What does the future hold in this, well, this brave new multipolar world?
All right, because it's all well and good to analyze the trends.
Yeah.
But what we really want to know is, what does it mean for for peace, for the global economy, for the planet as a whole? Is multipolarity ultimately a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And like most things in international relations, it's not a simple black and white answer. I mean, there are potential upsides and downsides. It really depends on how things play out.
Okay, so let's break it down then. Let's start with the potential downsides, the risks. What are some of the things that keep you up at night when you think about this multipolar world?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is that it could lead to greater instability and conflict. As these new powers flex their muscles, they're bound to bump up against each other. Their interests might clash.
Right, like we're already seeing in places like the South China Sea or Ukraine.
Exactly. And it's not just about military conflict. It could also lead to greater economic competition, maybe even trade wars. We could see a fragmentation of the global economy, a retreat from globalization.
So instead of a more interconnected world, we could end up with a world that's more divided, more fractured.
Yeah, that's definitely a risk. And then there's a question of global governance. In a multipolar world, it might be harder to reach consensus on issues that require global cooperation, like climate change or pandemics.
Because everyone's got their own agenda, their own priorities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So those are some of the potential downsides, but it's not all doom and gloom. There are also potential upsides to a multipolar world.
Okay, so give us some reasons to be optimistic then. What are some of the potential benefits of this power shift?
Well, for one thing, it could lead to a more balanced and equitable global order. For decades, the world has been dominated by a small group of Western
Right,
powers.
it's been a pretty exclusive club.
Exactly. But in a multipolar world, other countries, other regions would have a greater say. It could be a chance to create a system that's more representative, more inclusive.
So it's about giving voice to those who have been marginalized, who haven't had a seat at the table.
Precisely. And it could also lead to greater innovation and competition. When you have multiple centers of power, you're more likely to see different approaches, different ideas, different ways of doing things.
It's like a catalyst for creativity and progress.
Exactly. It could push everyone to up their game, to come up with new solutions to global challenges.
That's a really interesting point. So it seems like multipolarity is this kind of, well, it's a mixed bag, right? There's potential for both good and bad. It all depends on how things unfold, on the choices that leaders make.
Absolutely. And I think that's a key takeaway from all of this. The future isn't predetermined. We're not on some inevitable path towards either utopia or dystopia. We have agency. We have the power to shape the world we want to live in.
And that's a powerful message, especially for those UPSC aspirants out there who are going to be the future leaders, the policymakers, the diplomats who will be navigating this complex world.
Exactly. Understanding multipolarity, its challenges, and its opportunities is essential for anyone who wants to make a difference in the 21st century.
It's about understanding the forces at play, the different actors involved, the potential risks and rewards. It's about thinking strategically, about being adaptable, about finding creative solutions to complex problems.
It's about shaping the future rather than simply being shaped by it.
Well said. We've explored the rise of emerging powers, dissected the concept of multipolarity, and grappled with the complexities of this new world order. It's been a fascinating deep dive, and we hope you found it as insightful and thought-provoking as we have. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. And keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world around us.